Good evening, everyone. This is a regular monthly meeting of the Policy Subcommittee of the School Committee. I'm joined by two of the other subcommittee members, Dr. Andy Liu and Mr. Dimitri Anselm. We are also joined by several administrators. You can see Ms. Laham, Ms. Lataz. We're also joined, Ms. Neil Miller. We are also joined by Linda Monak, who is the CPAC co-chair, because later on in our agenda, we'll be discussing policy implications that pertain to special education students. So the first item, I'm going to note that this is being recorded. So for those of you who are not watching live, you'll be able to watch the recording afterwards. So first on our agenda for today is review and approval of the minutes for October 5th, 2020, the policy subcommittee meeting that convened on that date. Andy, did you have an opportunity to review them?
Yes, I did.
I've also reviewed them. Dimitri, I know you weren't an official member of the committee at that time, so welcome aboard. This is your first meeting of many. So I hope you enjoy being on the policy subcommittee. It's customary that sometimes if someone was not present for the meeting, it's okay if you want to abstain, but you can also vote to approve the minutes. That's up to you.
That's okay. I did review the minutes and documentation.
So would someone like to move the minutes?
Move them.
Okay. Do we have a second? I'll second. Andy?
Yes.
Dimitri?
Yes.
I also vote yes. So the minutes have been approved. All right, next we will move to a discussion and possible vote on the policy on immunizations. And just to provide a little bit of context, when we, the last couple times we met, we had discussed updating the immunizations policy to reflect changes that have occurred due to the coronavirus pandemic. There were some recommendations that were made by the MASC to make some updates, but after some initial discussion about it, we figured that it was not super pressing to rush something through, and also the draft language provided by the MASC was not particularly offering anything that would be new, that would be of particular use to us at this time. So we decided we would go in our own direction. I asked Ms. Laham, who is the head of nursing for the district, if she could put together a draft, and she has done so. Have the members of the committee had an opportunity to review?
Yes.
Ms. Laham, would you like to go over your policy and what made you decide to draft it in the way you did? And
sure. Well, our policy was definitely old and needed review. And even since I drafted this, I think I could make a couple of changes, but I wanted to just include that we wanted to be mindful of whatever the current recommendations from the state are, that those are the requirements for school attendance, and that it should include the language that it should be for all students entering from preschool through kindergarten, any grade, including foreign exchange students, because the same immunization requirements apply per state law. So I thought that was important to include. I also thought including language about homeless students who are protected by the McKinney-Vento Act while we work on obtaining their immunizations was important to include. Language that the only exceptions are a physician or a primary care provider's statement that a student is not, the language in here was that it was not in the best interest of the child. I think I would change that it would be medically contraindicated for a student. The only other exception is a parent's sincere religious beliefs.
all right, do we have some initial thoughts from members of the subcommittee about this immunizations draft? Andy?
Yeah, thank you, Tricia. I just have a question about the second sentence. Until these requirements are fulfilled, students will be excluded from school. Is the policy meant to exclude people even from, say, the remote learning academy if they haven't been immunized?
The law applies to all students, whether they are remote or in person.
I see. Okay, so this sentence is not then completely redundant with the one later on that says that certificates and exemptions have to be validated prior to any in-person attendance by the student in school activities.
Correct.
Okay, so then I guess it makes sense to leave this sentence in.
Jennifer, did you want to speak on this policy?
I just wanted to give some support for some of the changes that Tricia was going to make or suggested that we make, specifically about, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it in the policy. Towards the end, the exceptions on a written receipt from a physician, and I think we should change the language that is not in the best interest of the child, but should, since it's from a physician, should be something medically related, and that the other part I think is already in there about religious beliefs. So I just wanted to sort of reiterate that that was a question that I had, and I see it's a change that's already being made. I think that's it.
Can I just ask a question just to make sure I understand? So if we have the clause for religious beliefs, does that mean that therefore a student who may have a communicable disease would still be allowed to attend school because the parents have chosen not to vaccinate? Is that?
What it means is that they don't have to be vaccinated against the communicable disease, but if there should be an outbreak in school or the student themselves were ill, they would have to remain home. So
Okay.
There are provisions for that.
Okay, there are provisions for that. Okay, great. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to speak on this draft? So I myself am quite happy with it. Thank you very much for the hard work you put into this, Tricia, and in updating it, making it relevant for the present. It does seem to be all encompassing. I like how it's indexed to requirements of the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. For those of you who have looked at the present policy, it is very specific about particular vaccinations and about requirements that are, some of which are now obsolete. So this very much needed to be updated, and it's been done in such a way that hopefully this is a policy that could last us well into the future because it's nimble in that manner. Jennifer, I see you wanted to speak again.
No, I just also wanted to speak in support of having to update those exemptions annually. I really liked the inclusion of that language. Sorry, that was just an afterthought.
All right, now normally what we do is when there's a new draft, we provide an opportunity for the public to offer some comments on it, and then we vote on that draft at a subsequent meeting. In this particular situation, because we have discussed immunizations before, there was an opportunity for the public to comment. So what are the thoughts of other subcommittee members? Are you comfortable recommending this to the full committee yet, or would you like to wait one more policy meeting so that members of the public will have further opportunity to opine? This was posted last Friday on our website. Jennifer?
So just to clarify, David, we could make a recommendation to the full school committee, and then because that's a first read at school committee, we could still take comments from members of the public and incorporate that into future drafts. So there still is opportunity for the public to comment, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Andy, Dimitri, do you have thoughts on that, or do you think we're ready to recommend this to the full committee?
I'm happy to proceed.
Yeah, I'm happy to proceed as well.
All right, so would someone like to move that we recommend this to the full committee?
I'll move it.
Second?
Okay, Andy,
Yes.
Dimitri,
Yes.
Jennifer?
Yes.
I also vote yes. So shortly, the full school committee will take this on, and as Jennifer mentioned, members of the public will have ample opportunity to provide comment on this policy, and we certainly take public input very seriously. So I recommend that those of you who may have a particular interest in this, feel free to contact us with any questions you might have, any proposed edits. And I'll add that, do we want to move this with the recommendation of the edit that Tricia made of medically indicated for that student? That was an assumption I made, but I just want to double check that with everyone. Yes?
I would support that, yes.
Okay, so that'll be the language that we have recommended. All right, so the next item on our agenda, discussion of the policy on harassment complaint procedures and a possible vote. We have with us today Attorney Justin Gomes, who took the time and to utilize his expertise as a legal expert in this field to look at our existing policy and modify it for statutory changes that were made to Title IX. And this draft that you see before you today is a reflection of his efforts to put that all together in a digestible manner so that it's not too long, as subcommittee members had recommended, as well as members of the public who had expressed concern that sometimes if you have a policy that's too long and too wordy, it can be very cumbersome to sift through it and really understand its impact on a practical level. So I greatly appreciate, Justin, that you were able to keep this relatively brief and to the point. So would you like to present the draft and discuss what your thoughts were and how you put it together?
Sure. So I apologize if I cut out. If I do, feel free to somebody raise their hand and let me know that's the case. I'll start by saying that what I really wanted to do here was take your existing draft, make some edits to the general language regarding harassment that would make the policy more akin or in line what's being done across the state and as well as what's recommended by Mass Association of School Committees. And then in reference to Title IX and the new regulations that were promulgated by Title IX and the education amendments from back in 1972, they recently updated the regulations about what specifically needs to happen in regards to addressing sexual harassment at publicly funded educational institutions. When we did that, I really tried to not depart to anything additional than what's required by the rules. As I had explained perhaps at the last meeting or at least the last time that I was here, there are really 3 things or maybe 4 things that are mandated by these new regulations, and they're included in their policy. We try not to include anything too much additional to that. That way you're able to leave some discretion with the school district as well as your superintendent and your administration when it comes to implementing these policies. So those 3 things are: adopt essentially what has been mandated as a definition of sexual harassment by Title IX. 2, mandate that we train on those regulations as well as our procedures. 3, which I should have said second, which is adopt procedures for implementing and publish those. And then finally, you have to have all those trainings, all of these materials easily accessible online, as well as a variety of other areas, so the public has really no worries or really no difficult time when it comes to finding out, all right, if I'm going to bring a sexual harassment complaint, or where do I go and what's it going to look like once the ball gets rolling. So that's in brief what it is. You may notice from the draft is I make specific references to Title IX. There were some other places in your harassment policy previously where it made references to the law generally. As a practice, I like to take those out unless absolutely necessary, because we reference the what are the laws and regulations that we refer to at the end, and as well as to give some signposts for any reader that this is our Title IX policy. This is when we're getting into the Title IX section of our harassment policy. So if there are any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them, or do the best I can in doing so. That's certainly the case. And if there's anything that you want to talk out, I'm also willing to do that as well.
All right, so Andy, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Reading through these documents, the language seems very clear. Actually, very, very good to read through. I'm wondering about the document that's titled Title IX Grievance Procedures. So is that meant to be the public-facing document that tells people what to do when they need to file a grievance, or is that still one level of abstraction above what we would actually put on the website and make accessible to students?
Yeah. So there's two things at play here. So there's the adoption of the actual sexual harassment policy, the definition as defined by the regulations, and then the adoption of grievance procedures. Those grievance procedures, I'll tell you, though I believe some school committees may have done so, those are usually left for the superintendent to adopt, but they need to be published along with this policy. And the reason for that is that the grievance procedures, just like any other procedures that would be adopted or utilized superintendent, are really, after ed reform, within the purview of the superintendent. However, you need to, I'm of the belief that you need to see both of them in order to make sense of what the regulations are asking for and really understand what's going on here. So to answer your question, there's the policy, and then the procedures will be along with it. That's the execution of the policy.
Okay, but that document is not itself what the public might consult first of all in figuring out just what to do when they need to file a complaint.
It needs to be published along with any other materials, but it would be a document that you would consult because it is something that the district is going to be utilizing. It needs to be published.
Jennifer?
So, well, I have a couple of thoughts. Just in responding to your comments now, it seems that we don't have that document. So it seems that we would need to have both of those pieces, unless we do have that document. I mean, that's not necessarily something that we need to approve. I don't know if that document is ready. And if we publish this at some point, clearly not today, we would need to have the policy and the procedure that matches it. And I'm not sure that we're ready for that at this point. I did think that this did a nice job of separating out the policy and the procedure. So that was really helpful to me in sort of delineating what is policy and what is procedure. So that was very helpful. And I think that it really minimized a lot of the language and made it much clearer what needs to happen. I did have two kind of specific questions in reading it, I think maybe you could respond to, Justin. One is under the informal resolution of sexual harassment, and the very last line says, informal resolution shall not be offered in the event that the respondent is a district employee. And I was just wondering if you could speak to why that might be. I don't know if it's part of the law, and that would just be helpful for me to know in reading the policy.
So that is part of the law. The law prohibits informal resolution or mediation, as it's sometimes referred to, when the respondent is an employee. Okay, and that's helpful. Thank you. And then the second one is under retaliation, and was second guessing myself on the language in that line, that the district strictly prohibits retaliation in any form against persons seeking protection under or participating in an investigation related to this policy. Could you just clarify if that holds true for both the claimant and the respondent? Or does this offer only protection to the complainant? No, it would offer protection to anybody participating in the process. And the reason for that is you could arguably have a per se Title IX investigation because somebody is coming forward as a witness. So we don't want to just offer protection to the complainant and respondent, but also, what if somebody's coming forward as a witness, there's supporting somebody in an allegation, offering facts for an allegation of sexual harassment, or on the contrary, refuting, some of the evidence. So you certainly don't want, to the greatest extent you can, even though these policies are arduous, the idea is that the retaliation clause minimizes any chilling effect that they would have.
Thank you.
We have a question from the public about whether this policy needs to reference the Massachusetts anti-bullying statute.
I believe it may be referenced in, and I apologize, I don't know, but I believe that the policy may be referenced throughout the language, but or even in the references. Of course, it could reference the anti-bullying statute, but we do have bullying policies for that. Or I haven't personally, I was only charged with looking at harassment and sexual harassment in Title IX, but I'm assuming that you have a bullying policy, and I'm typically hesitant of throwing too many things in there because it could potentially confuse, and there's different mandates depending on what the conduct are by state and federal not law enforcement, but investigatory agencies.
Now, a follow-up question I have to Jennifer's raising the topic of retaliation. The process around that would be further fleshed out once the superintendent adopts some procedures that are in line with this document. Is that the intention?
So I apologize. I don't know what was sent. I know that I sent two documents. One of them was the general harassment policies, and the other ones would be the procedures.
Yes.
And do you have both of those documents? One of them should say Brookline Title IX procedures on the top. So that is actually going to be the procedures by the superintendent. Now, the superintendent or the district is apt to amend those in any way, but that is more or less what is required by law with or by regulation at this point.
So I'm sorry, David, my comments were, and I realize now that the title, this is procedures, because this read to me like a policy. So I think that I made an assumption that when I was reading documents in order in my email, that this was a policy and not procedures. Because I'm not sure if I was following these procedures, I would know what to do. And I was thinking that procedures, which are not subject to our input, so to speak, would be a little bit more delineated, sort of steps, timelines, when I needed to do things. I was thinking this was the policy, actually, that sort of lays out the sort of general scene of things, how things go, the general procedure, as part of like what we're putting in our policy. So I think I need to look, I'm going to take this time to look at the other document.
Well, so I'm looking at both documents side by side, and just to Jennifer's point, it's not entirely clear to me what the specific order of steps would be, hence my question of whether there's something that the superintendent would develop. Because yes, I have both documents. So there's retaliation under Title IX grievance procedures, is that one paragraph, and then it's also addressed on page 3 of the other document of the policy itself. But even there, while it lays out what would be prohibited, what's allowed, what's not allowed, it doesn't have a step-by-step process in terms of what actually happens if retaliation has occurred. So I'm wondering, is that something that ought to be spelled out in the policy, or is that something that would be developed later by the superintendent that falls within the parameters of the policy?
I would say that it's typically the discretion of the superintendent, because it's the execution of the policy. I mean, the way I usually describe it is, the policy is what we stand for, and the procedures are how we stand for it, to simplify. Now, the range of discipline or the exact manner or execution of how you deal with retaliation isn't specifically delineated in the regulations. I would leave it to your judgment, or perhaps the superintendent's judgment, if that's the practice in most other policies as well, as to what to do there. One thing I will say about the procedures that were provided is they are specifically geared to what the regulations say, and that is purposeful, because just as much as they say what you have to do, there are a lot of things that are prohibited, and you would not want to include additional language or perhaps too many steps that could put you into that area of prohibited conduct that by the new regulations. Of course, it's a case-by-case situation, and we would likely, if you're in a situation where you have a Title IX investigation, especially if it's serious conduct, some of the conduct referenced in Title IV, I'm sorry, in Section 4, you're going to be involving counsel. You're going to be making judgment calls with professional disciplinarians, and as well, much of this conduct is going to be duplicative. So, well, I shouldn't say duplicative, but I should say it's going to overlap other policies that you have. So there was the reference of the bullying policy. It's going to overlap a bullying policy. There may be concurrent investigations by state agencies, whether it's law enforcement or DCF, and those are going to involve a number of judgment calls as well. So I put that, I always like to add that as an additional point for not, for leaving the discretion with the superintendent when it comes to the procedures.
Okay. Andy?
Yeah, so this seems to bring us back to a couple of questions that I think have come up in our previous discussions of this. So number one is the policy is meant to cover sort of all forms of discrimination and harassment, whereas as it's written, the grievance procedures are specifically about sexual harassment, right? So I think we would need to figure out how much of that would carry over to other investigations of other kinds of harassment, right? And then what you brought up, Justin, the overlap with bullying, like for a given incident, is it always going to be clear which one of the policies applies, first of all? We do have a bullying policy. It's not this one. So.
Yes. No, I don't believe it's going to always be clear. As well as to your first point regarding general harassment procedures, there's no mandate, or at least none that I'm aware of, that says that you have to have these specific things published, your grievance procedures published, as does Title IX. I think arguably it would be a good practice, to have procedures that are akin, but in many ways, these, or at least in some people's perspectives, these procedures are very, very limiting. However, they're what's required by regulation, so I try not to depart or insert too many judgments on them.
I could also add, Maria, if you don't mind speaking more specifically, I think this might answer your question too, Andy, is when a case comes forward, what the investigator will do is look through the lens of multiple statutes, like, is this bullying? But then maybe this might be a Title IX case, in which case you're running two different investigations also, which Maria has certainly done, and some folks at the school too.
So you investigate it under every rubric that it falls under. You don't just pick one or the other.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I do also want to mention that, we're speaking a little bit more heavily to Title IX grievance procedures, but the district does have harassment procedures as well for all, discrimination. So when a complaint comes in, that's the responsibility of the Title IX coordinator and the coordinator of all of the other areas of discrimination to determine what does this fall under. Is this a Title IX you know, as defined by Title IX, or would this fall under our other harassment complaint procedures or bullying? So that would be one of the responsibilities of the Title IX coordinator in doing that.
And Maria,
do you think that current procedures that are in place would fit within the rubric of the policy drafts that have been presented today?
So I think there are, well, the current harassment procedures, for the most part, would fall under what we do. There does have to be a very specific Title IX grievance procedure because there are very specific regulations of what we have to do there. So that's why there are two separate procedures. So for the most part, I say, but we do need to look at the procedures to make sure, because there are some areas where we want to make sure what our policy instructs people to with respect to like reporting falls in line with our you know, the procedures, and in some places it doesn't, and that would cause confusion. So that's why I say we have to just kind of take a look at those to make sure things are in line after the committee, you know, determines what the policy is.
Do you have an example or two that you could use for illustration?
Sure. So, for instance, in the policy right now that we're looking at under duties and responsibilities, on page 4, it says the superintendent is responsible for receiving complaints of violations by the principal or the deputy superintendent. And in our policy and in our procedures, that isn't actually what typically occurs. There's depending on who it is, if the report is against the Title IX coordinator, let's say, then somebody would file with the Deputy Superintendent of Support Services. So that's why there are some conflicting pieces of information that we want to make sure we're very clear with for the public, and it doesn't conflict our policy and our procedures.
All right. Dimitri, is there anything about these drafts you'd like to bring up?
No, David, thank you.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I'm really feeling like the policy has more specificity than the procedures does, which I'm just having a hard time wrapping my brain around. It just seems, I don't know. I'm just feeling like the procedures are not specific enough. I don't think that members of the community would know what to do with that. And we need to make sure we add in some of the contact information that's missing in parts of it. I am wondering, we had a conversation, I believe we had a conversation at a prior meeting where we were going to ask, we had asked, I think maybe the last 2 meetings, to get some information about what the number of investigations that we typically have in a year. I feel like we had asked if we could get some of that information, and I don't know if anyone has that yet for us, because part of the policy is that we get a report on that each year, which we haven't had. And so I don't know if we have that information that's tangential to actually the policy itself, but it was a question that I had based on our prior conversation. I'm still finding it, I just don't think that the procedures, in my opinion, are going to necessarily, there's nothing in here about the contact information. Is there a specific form that needs to be used? So I'm just thinking through that as if I needed to utilize this set of procedures, would I know what to do? In fact, I think that the policy itself outlines very specifically the kinds of behaviors that, or not to be limited to that list, but include a list of things that are prohibited. So I'm just having a hard time with the division between the two. Are other people clear on the divisions and feel comfortable with them, or?
I agree with you, Jennifer. I'd like to see a little more specificity so that those who are impacted by the policy would have a better sense of what it is that exactly they're supposed to do. I think that most would probably contact the superintendent or deputy superintendent and just ask, okay, what next? But I think it's more helpful if they actually have on paper some kind of rubric to follow. it doesn't have to be super specific, but sort of a roadmap of what to expect and what their rights are. And while I appreciate that sort of the broad picture is provided for us in the current policy, sort of that step-by-step practical guide piece I think is missing and would really be essential in order for this to be a document that people could follow.
Just to one point, and perhaps it's out of the purview, of the subcommittee, but additionally, there would be a training that would be posted along with this as well. That training is going to achieve many of the things that you're talking about. It's going to have more simplified step-by-step direction on what this actually means. So just when thinking about the documents and where they'll be located, it'll be these two documents together along with the training and any other materials in which the district relies upon for training its staff and throughout the course of an investigation, because that's what's required.
So are we required to, I think I was reading in the policy that training is required not just for staff and for investigators, but it should be included in the student handbook and students should be trained as well. Is that correct?
Yes, so there are a lot of training requirements under Title IX, and all of those things, all of the training is posted, will need to be posted clearly on our website.
The training, you mean like people would access the training on the website, or just the parameters around the training would be listed on the website? Okay, so this is something, this is, there's just a lot to this, which I know we are all aware of, but there's just a lot of parts for, I think, for members of the community to understand. So it sort of gets into like our student handbooks and needing to update that, needing to train staff, needing to train investigators, needing to train staff, like who needs to report, sort of this mandated reporting to make sure that staff and other adults in the building are aware, and then training students in an age appropriate manner and who does that and when that takes place. That's a lot that's not in the procedures as well. But I just really want to reiterate how important I think it is in these procedures that there is something that directs people with where to go and how to begin the process aside from the training. And I just feel like that's missing. It would be really hard to know what to do and how to get started if I wanted to, file a complaint, I think.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, the procedures will need to be, they're not finalized in any way, shape, or form at this point. But some of the information that will drive how we develop the procedures will be the policy that the committee determines. So that piece is very helpful. I did want to speak to the numbers piece of it. I sent out some information earlier to David, just speaking to it a little bit. So over the course of the last 5 years, we have had 5 substantiated sexual harassment incidents that were reported to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. I think that number is a skewed reflection of some actual behavior in many ways, because there are things that occur in any particular incident that involve different things and different kinds of behavior. It really, it's really based on the investigation at the time and, what occurs where the administrator ends up deciding what this should be filed under. So I think there's a bigger umbrella of different kinds of behavior, but they might be choosing 1 or 2 specifics to say, I'm going to categorize this as, sexual harassment only. I don't know if that made it clearer or more.
It was a little bit hard to I wasn't really sure. I'm a little unclear about the second half, but I did just wanted to follow up. So if we've had 5 substantiated incidents, how many complaints were actually filed? as
Right.
what I'm curious about, like how many complaints were filed versus how many were found to be substantiated.
So that's a more challenging number to secure. Our student database reporting system isn't very friendly with respect to conduct issues and collecting data around that. So there's not an easy way to cull that data out. So it's really, we're looking at more of the substantiated cases.
But I would think that there's some way to log total number of complaints, even by certain categories, because before something is substantiated, it's sort of in a limbo period during the investigation. So those numbers are not available?
So those numbers aren't documented in our student database. So a report could come in, there could be an investigation. You know, all of this is really heavy paper-based, you know, all of the investigation components of it. And then once that's completed, the paperwork gets sent to the central office. So it's really all hard copy paper and not documented necessarily in our student database system unless it is substantiated.
Do you
Just
have some
thinking
rough estimate of what it might look like, or is it triple digits, or for a similar time frame?
So that would require at this point going through all of our hard copy paper reports that basically get sent back up to central office.
Are there that many that it would take a long time to do? I'm just concerned that we don't have a system for tracking this information, and I think we should be able to speak to it. And if we didn't have one, I think this is maybe the time to come up with a system for being able to track that information. It seems like valuable information that we would want to know about.
So I have that information. All of those come to me, and it's not in the triple digits at all.
So just to note, my sense is what I think we're noting is that there may be either inefficient processing in terms of how we get this information, but for us not to get into the management of this. So I think the recommendation ought to be that clearly this is an area that we would want to get from the school management to sort of revise their procedures and so on and update us on it.
Right, because part of working on a policy is knowing how pervasive a problem is. And if we don't really know what the numbers are, then that part of it's a bit difficult.
Yep.
So
Yep, no, totally. I think we have a legitimate ask for numbers. I just don't want us to start going into what the procedure at the district level should be. I think they have to come up with their procedure and how to track it and being able to give us that information.
Andy?
So I believe that part of our reason for kind of wanting to know about numbers was to figure out whether to extend the relatively onerous Title IX procedures to other forms of harassment as well, if we had some notion of how many of what type of complaint was being filed. So Casey, if you have some sort of general idea of how many are coming in, do you also have a general idea of how many would end up under Title IX, and whereas compared to ones that wouldn't?
So I should be clearer, sorry about this. So I have the bullying investigations that make it up to me.
Uh-huh.
But in terms of the Title IX, I think Maria has those.
And that's the number that I reported. 5 across 5 school years.
Yep.
All right, we have another question from Ms. Stillman, member of the public, about training in discretionary filings. So how does that currently work?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but if perhaps the district could answer it.
Yeah, I'm not sure what this audience member means by discretionary filing. Maria?
I think my guess might be that even if a victim does not directly report something, if a staff person is observing conduct that would fall under this policy, so is there training around that of identifying someone who's a victim and coming forward on the victim's behalf?
So we have developed a training in response to the Title IX new regulations specifically, which have gone out, and employees are in the process of completing it, where they are trained specifically in reporting. And you know, I'm assuming it's a, you know, I've seen something or I've heard something is what I'm assuming the question is about, versus a formal grievance being filed, right? Somebody who has heard or seen something and they want to tell somebody, and versus a formal filing. So all employees are trained now that they must report to their building principal or the Title IX coordinator. And if it's to the building principal, then the building principal funnels that up to the coordinator.
All right, thank
And
you.
Maria, just to make sure that I understand what you said earlier, that it seems that even if something is reported, the coordinator still has discretion in terms of determining whether something is Title IX or not.
Right. There's very specific outline of whether it is Title IX or not.
Right.
So it really is the coordinator determining, are we going to respond to this through Title IX, or are we going to respond through this with one of our other policies or our student code of conduct?
Code of conduct. So we have 5 cases in 5 years because it was determined that these 5 cases fell under Title IX, but there may have been other, clearly there were more complaints, but only 5 that were categorized and deemed to meet.
Correct. Sexual harassment. Correct.
All right, so it sounds, go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just going to say, so I heard Casey talk about the bullying complaints, and then Maria was talking about the Title IX. What happens, is there another area of, like, because the policy is about harassment as well? Does that all fall under bullying, the bullying policy, or procedures, or like this, there's other categories of harassment? I'm not being clear. Is there another category here of harassment complaints besides bullying and sexual harassment? And where are those numbers, or where does that go?
So I get, between the two of us, I think we get all of them, if that's your question. I don't want to go into specifics about the different types of harassment complaints that we get, because some of them are easily identifiable because they're confidential. So they come to, in terms of process, some go to the it really depends. Some go to the superintendent, some have come to me. You know, some have gone to Maria, administrators at the building level, guidance counselors. And then those who begin to investigate will sort through what lens are we going to examine this complaint.
To Jennifer's question, though, if something is not of a sexual nature, does the bullying policy and bullying procedures cover it? Whatever it might be, if it's not sexual harassment, would it fall under the procedures for bullying?
If it's not sexual harassment, does it fall under bullying?
Right, for the procedures.
So we would, yes. So for the purpose of looking at students, that's what our schools would do. If it has to do with adults, then that goes to HR, and that's a different set of procedures.
So there is a third category of procedures here as well. There's the Title IX procedures that we're looking at right here, the Title IX grievance procedures we looked at tonight. And then there's the bullying policy and the procedures for that. And then there's also a general, like a larger category of harassment that has its own procedures. But in our policy for school committee that we're contemplating right now, it's titled discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, and retaliation. So we're attempting to cover all forms of harassment and sexual harassment within this policy, but separately there are 3 sets of procedures. And I think that was one of the questions we had, and maybe Justin, I think it sounds like your recommendation is to combine the harassment and sexual harassment policy into one policy and separate out the procedures separately. Is that, do I understand this correctly?
Yes, and that is the case, and I think that's typically the way it was operating before, because we had mandates to specifically address sexual harassment before, but they were under state law. They weren't as onerous in actually defining what the sexual harassment was or defining what was supposed to happen in terms of regulations. But for example, there was an allusion earlier to the fact that the policy included examples. That's because that's required by state law. That's not actually required by Title IX. So technically our policy covers what's required by state law and federal regulation. And to realistically, I think it just makes sense, right? If there's harassment, the broader category, if they were to one day come up with a type of harassment that required additional specific attention, say it was harassment, discriminatory harassment based on race, then we would have a separate section on that. But what's required is a general harassment policy, specific sexual harassment, addressing sexual harassment specifically because of the unique nature of it, and that originally stemmed from concerns about sexual harassment within the workplace. But I do believe that it's important to have an overarching harassment policy because I think as a practical matter, I'm sure Brookline would contend that no one particular harassment is less important than the other. There is what's required by law, and we will comply with the law, but we prohibit all forms of harassment, and that's why it's nice to have it in one place.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I guess my last comment, I think for now would just be that I think when we publish this as school committee as a policy, it would be helpful to have the specific set of procedures for all of these different categories published at the same time so that members of the community can figure out where to start.
All right, so it sounds like at least 2 of the subcommittee members would like to see a little more detail in terms of what the procedures will be. As for how we move forward with that, is this something that the district intends to work on relatively soon so that it could be rolled out at about the same time as the policy, or what's the time frame look like for that?
So we have, the recommendation, the procedures that Justin provided to us, as well as the interim policy and procedures that we originally submitted or put out to ensure that the district was compliant at the time. So it's really just the, district, superintendent and folks coming together to ensure that those everything is in line. But again, some of the driving force of that is looking at what the policy is. So understanding where the school committee is going with the policy to ensure that they're in line with each other.
I'm just trying to look at this from the perspective of those in the community who want to know what are their rights, what should they do, what steps do they follow, maybe if it's a checklist or something that would be simple for them. Because this policy at the macro level, yes, it's great, and I really like how it's been simplified, and I appreciate that. But just the step-by-step piece of it, because the interim policy, I've looked at it, and it's also excellent, but it's also extremely long. And I think that for someone to try to go through that and interpret what the step-by-step part would be is difficult. So I'm just wondering if at some point it would be possible for us to provide for the public a checklist or a flow chart or some way to easily follow what the procedures are.
So we certainly,
Justin, in your experience, what do you see from other districts? Do they have this in their policy documents? I just want to separate what's practice and in the purview of administrators and what's policy subcommittee. It gets confusing with staff, and I think what I don't want to see is too much going into a policy that then hamstrings those of us who are implementing the policy and the procedures. I just want to make sure we sort of get that check and balance.
Right,
So-
and I just wanted, and I'm so sorry, Justin, and I just wanted to emphasize the interim policy was very procedure heavy, right? So it's important that that piece is to Casey's point, separate from the policy piece, because it is such a heavy document. It really, there are many steps through that, and in some ways it's not a very easy ask to simplify it, because there are so many steps to a grievance procedure.
And to answer your question, Casey, typically what happens is the sexual harassment policy is adopted, and that does not include as much procedure. I would say that for two reasons right now. One of them is like I said at the outset, that there's certain things that are in the purview of the superintendent and others that are in the school committee. The other one is a very practical one. It was actually alluded to in the chat earlier. With the change of administration that is potentially or likely upcoming, there's been a lot of debate over these. Both parties, both candidates had their positions on Title IX, and if President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in January, I expect that there's going to be revisions around Title IX. Those revisions will likely more gear towards what the procedures are, and the administration is going to have to turn pretty quickly to adjust what their new what the procedures are, so they can be compliant with the new Title IX regulations once they're promulgated again in January or shortly thereafter. So it's twofold. It's one practical, one legal as to what's required by ed reform.
All right. Any final thoughts on this for today? Because we're at the 1 hour mark and have some other topics to cover. Andy, Dimitri?
I just want to highlight for the district staff that I do think the comment from the public in the chat around whenever we're ready to publish, if we could figure out a way to have some kind of visual way to explain the procedures, that might be helpful to the public, not only to the public, but I think to students, faculty, and so on. So if there are ways that, of course, we would publish the written, but if there are ways to be able to generate some flow chart, something creative and visual, I think that would be very helpful.
Andy?
So do we think we should move forward on the policy without waiting for the procedure to be finalized? Or do they need to be done at the same time?
So it sounds like procedures are already in place, and that usually any modification to those procedures would follow adoption of a policy, because I'm not sure how you can develop procedures if you don't know what you're developing them toward. So they probably would come after. I would just want to make sure that any modifications that take place are representative of some of the inputs that has been provided today about clarity, transparency, understanding the process.
As far as the policy goes, though, are we ready to advance that, or do we need more discussion of that?
I'm comfortable with advancing it. How do others feel?
I'm comfortable with advancing, but it sounded like from what Jennifer was asking that this issue about numbers, I mean, Maria gave us numbers, but I think the larger type of harassments that we get and how many we get, the larger school committee may be asking it. So I don't know if there's a way to get that before it moves to the whole school committee.
Jennifer?
David, I was just wondering as chair if you have gotten any feedback on these policies from members of the public?
I have, yes. Most of them pertain to retaliation. Others want us to look at how this policy would work in concert with bullying and about any change and about implications for procedures on the bullying side. So I would say those are the two most common.
And do you feel like this current policy addresses the concerns and questions, or there are outlying questions and concerns from the community that we need to discuss?
I think those concerns pertain more to the procedural side, which is why I'm trying to kind of push this idea of having some kind of easy to follow rubric or flow chart or some way of understanding what are the rights, what are the expectations, what will the process look like, what will be the time period, who will be my point of contact, who can I bring with me, what do I have to write when, who do I send XYZ to, can I appeal, if so to whom. It doesn't have to be super specific, but I think that those types of elements would be helpful. And if members of the public and even more importantly, our own students, because I want to make sure our students know what exactly it is to do. So I think if we can have something like that available, that would alleviate some of these concerns that have been brought to our attention. So I don't think it's so much an issue with the language of the policy. It's more making sure that there is an understanding of the practical implications of the policy for individuals, both on the complainant side as well as the defendant.
And if we bring this to full committee, there's still time for the public to make comment on this and to make revision.
Yes, certainly.
So I guess I'm okay with forwarding the policy because it's still open. I would second the idea of a visual for assisting students and members of the public. The existing document that we looked at that's really thick that I believe Maria mentioned is it's not easily navigated, and I think it would become overwhelming, especially in a highly stressful situation like the kinds we're talking about. So I do think a visual or something much clearer would be very helpful. And I also think a system for being able to like talk about these numbers and think about the kinds of patterns or issues that we may want to address system-wide. I think that would be helpful to have a system for these numbers, because it would be just interesting to know from a high level. I'm not interested in putting procedures into our policy. That's not what I'm interested in doing, but I am interested in understanding patterns or the way our system as a whole is operating. And so we need information to do that. And so it would be helpful to sort of know, the number of complaints about harassment or sexual harassment or bullying that we get, without any level of detail. Clearly, I very much want to honor people's privacy, but buckets of numbers would be very helpful in understanding the progress of our district, and that is within our role.
Okay. And again, Maria, at least from my perspective, I'm not trying to suggest either that every single detail should be included, but really a very broad overview of contact person A. You will hear back from person B within 10 days. You will then have 2 weeks to prepare for a hearing, whatever it might be, just sort of at that level. I think that would be helpful.
David, I just wanted to draw attention. There's a comment in the chat about what to do if a complaint is against someone within that chain of decision makers, for example, against the superintendent or the person who is overseeing it. And I do think that is in the policy, if I remember correctly. I do think it is actually already included in the current policy and procedures that we're looking at tonight.
Yeah, so it'd be investigated and handled by a disinterested third party within the district. Is that correct, Justin?
That's correct, as well as the, at least in the context of sexual harassment, those roles are not assigned until the formal complaint is lodged. And that is by design. That way, you're able to alleviate any concerns for bias or conflicts of interest. Presumably, everybody will identify if they have a conflict of interest before they not volunteer, but or take the role of a decision maker or investigator, and so forth.
All right, so would someone like to move recommending the harassment procedures policy and the grievance procedure to the full school committee, which again just allows us to discuss these policies with the full committee. We'll still be soliciting input from the public. This allows us to hear from other school committee members as well, of course, and hopefully we'll have some more of that additional information that's been requested from subcommittee members. So would someone like to move the policy?
Can you just clarify, David? You mentioned the policy and the procedures, but we're not actually recommending the procedures, correct? We're just forwarding a policy. Is that right?
Right, so the policy on harassment complaint procedures.
Can you clarify the title? Because I have a different title. Because there's the policy against discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, and retaliation, which is section J6. And then there's a document called Title IX Grievance Procedures. But if I understand correctly, we're not forwarding the grievance procedures, just the discrimination policy. Is that correct?
Yes, so the document that's titled Section J, Students Policy Against Discrimination, Harassment, Sexual Harassment, and Retaliation.
Okay.
Would someone like to move that policy for the full committee?
David, I'll make a motion to move that policy to the full school committee.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
All right, Andy,
Yes.
Dimitri,
Yes.
Jennifer,
Sure. That's a yes.
and I also vote yes. All right. Thank you very much, Justin, for all your hard work on this and for providing very detailed answers. And thank you as well, Maria and Casey, for providing us with some answers to our questions. All right, so next up, we have a discussion of the yearbook policy. So we do not currently have an existing yearbook policy. This was something that I drafted based off of a couple of templates that I found from some high schools, and I kind of reworked the language and added some other provisions. The reason I'm bringing this forward now is because I received quite a few comments from people who wanted to see us have a yearbook policy, especially now during the pandemic with schools partially closed. It's been difficult for students to feel like they're part of a community. So we want to make sure that students have that type of inclusion. And one way to accomplish that is through a yearbook policy. So members of the subcommittee had it up. Mary Ellen?
David, the school committee does reference the yearbook and in their policy, students' rights and responsibilities. So that's J4F. It is dated 1971, but it's page J35. It's number 7. It's pretty short. I can read it to you, but it's actually interesting language. I didn't get a chance to read your review, but anyway, just want to make sure you were aware that that was referenced in that policy.
Okay. If you could read it for us since
Sure.
you have it up.
Yeah, actually, it's broader than the yearbook. It says it's number 7 of 7 items. The student newspaper, the yearbook, the literary magazine, and other school publications are to be managed by the students. They are to bear the responsibility for the content and quality. An advisor mutually acceptable to the publication staff and the school administration is to be appointed each year. Among other functions, the advisor should serve as an intermediary between the publication staff and the administration. In any dispute involving content, the final judge shall be the publication staff. The staff is expected to maintain high standards of quality and accuracy, but no advisor, faculty member, administrator, or other members of the administration of the Brookline Public Schools shall have the power to overrule the staff on any matter of content. The primary responsibility of these publications is to the students. Pretty student forward facing. Back
Wow.
from 1971.
Okay.
So be aware. So something to consider.
Okay. Jennifer?
Well, I mean, I think that that language is very student facing and probably works well at the high school level and maybe not so well at our K through 8 level. I'm not even sure what publication staff would mean in terms of our yearbook. So that, I mean, I understand in a literary magazine or maybe even at the high school level where you might have, you know, we have a newspaper, we have lots of publications at the high school level, but, and I don't know if there are other publications aside from the yearbook at our K through 8s that are different from the yearbook in substance. And I know some of our K through 8s have 2 different yearbooks, an 8th grade yearbook and a K through 7. So I think that's a little bit complicated.
So Jennifer, what's also complicated about the K through 8s is those are not actually a function of the school. Most of the time they're a function of your parent organizations.
Right. And so I just think that this is creating the policy. You know, I think that we're sort of creating this not based on like an MASC policy. But David, thank you so much for doing the work of mining for other policies on which to base this policy from. I really appreciate the extra work and effort right now to do that. It's hard for me to, when I'm reading it, to sort of like, to not envision what this looks like procedurally. And I know that's not my lane, but I just want to make sure that we write a policy that is in alignment with what it is that we want and can do. And I just was wondering if anyone in the staff could, as it is a function of PTOs right now, we're talking about changing where this lives by bringing it into, this becomes, if it's the district, it becomes, should it not then be district employees that are implementing this policy? So I guess I just am curious to hear from other committee members about that. I'm just wondering, especially like in number 1 in inclusion, for this part, like students may, we need to have that someone would have to be in charge of this. It's like a whole nother project. And advisors, like who decides who the advisors are? Are the advisors volunteer parents? Are they staff members? Because you're talking about needing to have access to information that the PTOs may not have, or that may not be appropriate for people outside staff to have, like, you know, access to Aspen, access to out of district students, medically fragile students who may be learning at home. You know, is this something that goes through the parent portal? How do parents opt in? Is this different from the parent portal? Is this just a letter to opt out? Is this, I don't know. I have a couple of things under sections 3 and section 1 about inclusion and how parents opt in and out. Is this an opt-in or an opt-out? Is everyone in unless you opt out? And is the opting out for like photos of multiple kids, is that opt-out included and covered in the letter that needs to be done in section 1 part A? So I don't know. I'm just trying to envision what this would look like.
Well, at least what was intended, perhaps I can make it more specific, is basically if we look at section 1, number 1, all students enrolled in a school at any time during an academic year shall be, by default, be included in the school yearbook for that school if one is published. So the default would be inclusion. So include the student's name, include the student's picture. Now, if the parents, guardians, or a student who has a legal capacity to act on his or her own behalf decides to opt out, they would have that ability to do so in writing. So that's the general idea for this entire policy. Now, some of the additional specifics we can get into later, but I hope that addresses your first question. I think that's fairly clear in the language. Number 1 says shall by default be included.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yes. So then the question falls then, who is, I guess this is a procedure thing, but then somebody has to be in charge. Someone in-house has to be in charge of doing that work, because they're going to have access to information that other people are not going to have access to, which is fine.
But
And
someone's in charge of that information now. So I'm just envisioning whoever's doing it now is going to continue to manage that.
I think there is conversation in the chat on exactly that question that Jennifer is raising in terms of who's, so maybe one of the things we may want to have is language as to, is there a yearbook advisor or somebody who, or what is the role of a principal maybe in each building to have final say? So we may want to do that, but it looks like in the chat, members of the public are raising this issue, and should the PTO be handling it or not?
So I think there are two things you have to decide first. One is that you have the tradition of the high school graduation yearbook. So that's a tradition, that's a, like, you know, decades, 100 years old tradition where the yearbook was of that year, graduation class year, with its tradition there. We all probably have one in our house or have seen them. What you're also mixing, so there are two, so that has had a tradition, and yearbooks in high school have had a tradition where a number of the inclusion pieces are there by just culture of the school. There is a publication staff is the publication staff. They're working with you know, major printing companies like Jostens and others that have, you know, tradition of high school yearbooks across the country. So there's a level and a standard. Frankly, there's even awards for yearbooks and putting them together. There's restrictions around pictures and what the portraits look like. It's pretty precise science now with high school yearbooks. You're also talking about what's happening in a K-8 level, where that has typically been my experience in my 25 or 30 years of being in school finance, that and being around yearbooks and dealing with the finances around yearbooks has been much more of a building-based kind of school community-based document, sometimes formal, sometimes photocopied, color printed off a color printer. Not, you know, sometimes happen, sometimes don't. And so I think there's a distinction that should be made between a high school yearbook and the tradition of it versus a elementary yearbook. And there are two different, publications, I would say. Same rules probably, but level and quality of that publication are very different. Unless you're looking at, or members of the community in Brookline are looking at putting a high school style yearbook in place for every one of our elementary schools, of which the 8th grade would be the graduating year of the 8th grade, and you'd have the tradition of pre-K through 8 in that document like you would in a high school yearbook. So you have to think. For
myself, all I'm really looking for is to make sure that every student's included. So
I'm not sure you need I guess I'm wondering why you need a policy for that.
Because apparently every student's not being included.
Well, every student where? At the high school or at the elementary schools?
Slightly different issues. So sometimes students in the elementary schools are included, but certain portions of their yearbook entry are not published, and there's not necessarily equity in terms of representation there. And that's a concern in K-8. It's also a concern at the high school level. I'm not saying that everyone has to have an equal number of appearances, but I think everyone should at least appear once. And that's what I'm trying to guarantee.
Yes, there's typically the class group photo, yes, and or if the tradition is individual but smaller stamp size photos, yes, 100%. I guess I'm still wondering about whether you have a policy, need to go to a policy level. Certainly direction, certainly directive and direction if it's under the principal's name or under the, or you could say that any yearbook at the K-8 level would meet the, you know, the criteria set by the school district, for example, that met inclusion and, you know, you may have other big bullet items. I'm just sort of being a devil's advocate here. I'm not one way or the other. just want to make sure we're all clear. And making sure we may need to have the principals weigh in, because typically this would be sort of under a principal. The principal would be selecting the advisors. We don't have paid advisors at the elementary K through 8. We have a paid advisor at the high school. In fact, I think they split the stipend.
All right, I'm just a little bit perplexed as to why there would be so much complication around ensuring that everyone gets their name and picture in a yearbook.
It shouldn't be. I agree with you. There shouldn't be a problem. There shouldn't even, it shouldn't even be a point of, I 100% agree with and don't understand why that's even an issue and why it can't even get addressed just by a conversation.
All right, Linda, I will get to you, but I have to go to other committee members first. Dimitri?
Oh, I think Jennifer had her hand up, so I'll go after Jennifer.
All right, Jennifer?
I'm very patient, so Dimitri, I could have waited. It's not a big deal. But thank you. Oh no. So here's sort of where I feel like creating this policy is we need to create positions. This actually has, I believe, has a budgetary impact. What we're doing right now, as I understand it, and it's operating out with like volunteer labor doing this work and PTOs. The majority, not the high school necessarily, but the K-8s. If the PTOs are running it, they're volunteering it. And if we're saying that we're going to make a policy and we have to make sure that the staff would need to make sure that the policy is being followed. School committee doesn't make sure it's being followed. We institute a policy, and then someone has to make sure that it's happening. And the only way you could really, I don't know how, I don't know, and maybe there's another way, but some staff would need to be supervising this. So unless someone just gets assigned that, I don't know if that, I don't know. So I think that in creating the policy, we are creating a change in the way that yearbooks are being produced and made, because the PTO members are not going to have access to who's out of district, who's medically fragile. And I'm not sure if we're intending to include, we're saying at any one time during the year, a student who starts the year, stays for a month, and then perhaps moves out. Are we including all of those students as well? And so students who are not there at the end of the year, I just think we should be clear about, right. I don't have opinions about that. I just think that in creating a policy, we are changing the way things are being done. And I just think that we need to be aware of that and make decisions about what we want the policy to be if we're going to make a policy. But there are implications for workload and possibly budget that are implicated in this. Because if you need a faculty advisor and you need a paid staff to do it, then that has to be someone's job, which it is not right now. So you have to find someone who can take on the workload, or you have to offer a stipend. I'm not saying any of those are impossible, just saying that's something we need to be aware
All right, Dimitri?
So again, it seems like from the chat that there's a lot of interest around the topic and people would want to weigh in. But what I think I'm hearing from Mary Ellen is that there might be an in-between. So before we get to policy, we may have a district-wide set of procedures or district-wide guidelines. I think that's the word you were using, Mary Ellen. So we could have district-wide guidelines for how we think these yearbooks ought to be managed in K-8, because it sounds like from the chat, some people are being paid through some PTO funds, others are being paid through other funds. So clearly, again, there's not necessarily a consistent practice district-wide. So we could be looking at having some district-wide suggested guidelines for ensuring, and David, it would ensure what you're suggesting. So we would want to make sure the guideline says that everybody has to be included. There would be guidelines for how we're going to gather that information, who do we give that information to, and so on, prior to getting to policy.
All right, Andy?
I would just like to add my voice in support of David's point of view on this one. This does seem to me to have become unnecessarily complicated. I mean, yearbooks will be produced just as they always have been, to varying levels of quality and fanciness by the same people who have been doing it all along. All we're trying to do is make sure that everybody is included in them. Like, I don't see why this requires hiring extra staff or determining who gets to work on the yearbook. None of that. Just go on doing it as you've been doing with the same people in the same way, but include everybody. That's all there is to it, as far as I'm concerned.
That's how I see it. And Linda had a question in the chat about students who are over 18. So I did include some language about students who are in grade levels for multiple years and for those who are 18 or older, which is addressing those of our students who sometimes stay in the district at age 22. But Linda, go ahead. I want to give you an opportunity to speak.
I'm sorry, I know I have no standing to be speaking right now and my Bluetooth is about to go, but thank you, David. I was looking for that language and I just didn't see it, so it didn't seem clear to me where they fit in. And I'm not sure at what point they would want to be part of the yearbook, whether it would be in their year 18 or year 22 or every year that they're past that. But I do want to just say that yearbooks are really important to students. And there have been multiple instances of students with disabilities in particular being left out or edited in ways that their peers weren't edited. So having a really strong stance for inclusion to keep everybody on the same playing field is just really important. And PTOs follow district guidelines. We did a new nutrition policy. Now we can't have bake sales in front of the school. Happens all the time. You guys set the policy, PTOs have to follow it. I don't think it's onerous to just say every kid should be included and to make sure that the principals are giving the PTOs the list, and here's the list, you include all these kids. That's it. It just seems really, really important because for the children who have been left out, it's really hard. It's really hard for them.
Well, I guess I would like to state that none of my comments were meant to or should be perceived as me being against inclusion. Or not having inclusion. And Linda and I really appreciate the sentiment. Yearbooks are fraught with internal politics, and I think there is an absolute necessity, and I agree with the necessity of school committee keeping it very simple. Like, yearbooks should meet these following requirements. Inclusion, spell out what that means, but don't get into pictures and sort of the equity piece 1 and 2. I would invite the high school yearbook staff in. Frankly, this is a great learning opportunity, is invite the high school yearbook staff in and ask them how they deal with inclusion. Because the high school yearbook is the yearbook in a lot of kids' lives. Not that the elementary ones aren't, but I think they should be part of this conversation. Is how are you dealing with inclusion? What does that look like? What does the parity and equity look like? What are some of their editing standards that they have? To Linda's point, I think it's a great opportunity for the student yearbook staff and team to weigh in on this and be leaders for their younger peers and set a standard and an example. And then you end up with a structure for PTOs and the K through 8s is here's the high school yearbook standard. You get to practice on what that standard is, and here's what that looks like.
Jennifer?
Sorry, I'm going back to the actual policy that you prepared, David. Under section 3, proprietary considerations. And I guess I was just thinking about, well, I don't know. I'm thinking about my own experiences with the K-8 yearbooks. And I don't think in all the years that my kids have been in school here since they were in kindergarten, I don't think they've made a group photo once, like ever, either of my kids. And so I'm just looking at that particular line about identifiable individuals portrayed in any photographs must provide written consent in order for the photographs to be included. And I'm just wondering how we would do that. Like, that seems really time consuming.
Yeah, so the way we do that is the student picture day. So what that will require is the district taking on and taking over, as we should anyway, is the student picture day, where every student gets their picture done, whether they buy pictures or not. That's how you feed your yearbooks. Seniors have a different type of picture day because they're doing different portraits and things like that. So That's how you get every single student, by sending every single child through the picture day. That's one way that school can ensure that there's at least one stamp size photo of every child. Then you would also do on that picture day, in the old days, you would do at that same time, as kids were going through the line by class, you'd do a class picture that same day. At the same time, every kid went through that. So that's what picture day used to be. Jennifer, you probably run through it with your.
Yeah, my follow-up to that is, what about kids who are absent? What about kids who come to the school year after?
There's always makeup days. There's always makeup days.
Yeah, well, but kids, if they're absent on the makeup day and they weren't there, I'm just saying, if we're going to start delineating, I think we just need to be really mindful and really, thinking about how do we capture all of the kids, and how do we make sure that everyone's in there? I think everyone should get their picture in once. I think that's, me, that's really straightforward. It saddens me that we're here having this conversation. I do feel like I have to say that there's some conversation in the chat, and it's chat, but I really hope we could refrain from using people's names for the purposes of privacy in the chat as well, when we're talking about, we're not naming ourselves. So that's just, I just really want us to be mindful of that, especially people who aren't here. So I'm in favor of, clearly, I think everyone should be in the yearbook. That to me is very obvious. I think the mixed photos, just in the way that it's written, and I don't mean like the class photo where the class gets taken, because there's always somebody missing from that one too. Kids are just absent, or they came to school late. But the sort of, in a lot of the K-8 yearbooks, there are pictures of students in different activities, and, part of the school, the fabric of the school community. And so, I just don't know how we would get permission unless we're just going to say that people have to opt out. And if they opt out of to be in the yearbook, then we would have to go, whoever's in charge would have to go through all of them group photos, the candid, so to speak, and make sure kids aren't in there. So I'm just looking at the language and trying to see, like, if we're going to craft a policy, I just want to make sure that we catch everybody and go. I want to also go back to my question about, like, what about kids who move in and out of the system, and how are we planning to capture those children as well?
Just to answer your question, I was intending, I can make the language more clear, but my intention behind that was situations where each student in a class year is offered the opportunity to submit 3 personal photographs. And not the group picture one, not the picture of the student as an individual, but they say provide a quote of your choice and 3 pictures. And one of the pictures, there are 3 other people in it. You see their faces. We don't know who they are. That was really what I was aiming for there. So a picture that's taken at a school activity, of course, I think that would be fair game for inclusion. So I can clarify that point. And by having this, it's not saying that it's going to be a requirement that all students be offered the opportunity to submit additional pictures, but sometimes certain grade levels, I think it's usually 8 and 12, sometimes get that type of leeway.
Yeah, no, I think that if anyone's submitting personal pictures, to be added in, it should just be of the individual. I think that seems reasonable to ensure that everyone who's in the picture wants to be in. I guess I'm just sort of wondering about those candid shots that might be about community events. So things that happen at the school community. If someone opts out of having, like if a parent opts their child out of the yearbook, I just wanted the language to reflect that those group photos would need to be pulled too then, right? If they don't want their child's picture in the yearbook.
It actually has to do with the parents even opting in for their child to be photographed in general at all in school or at school activities. And that's really the one document and the one permission that guides yearbooks, picture inclusions and exclusions. In the high school yearbook, they have different terms for the different types of photos that you're talking about. I mean, they have sports, but the sort of clubs and activities pictures, the kind of social activity pictures, they have them all in different groupings. They have different requirements for them. Some yearbooks hire professional photographers to come to events and take professional photos and casual photos and of people at the event on purpose. So they have a certain quality level for printing purposes. They'll accept that's part of when you go to, the photography buff student at the high school. You have a bunch of photography students that will be taking photos at different events. for practice and resume building and publication in the yearbook. There's no reason you can't do that at the elementary level with, you know, middle school students who are budding camera picture photo buffs. They're taking selfies anyway. So I think there's, I think it'd be an interesting conversation to have with the high school yearbook staff about what their criteria are. I think it would be from their perspective. I've not ever talked to them, but I think it would be having my prior districts and dealt in working with them. They do have a standard, they have a methodology, and I think that would be very informative. And certainly about the inclusion piece, I think would be very informative for the committee to help with some of that language and standards that I believe you're setting and clearly from the chat at the K-8 level needs to be set and communicated.
All right, so we only have about 20 minutes left and still have some other topics to cover. Any parting thoughts on this issue? It's clearly something we're gonna have to take up again, which surprises me a little bit, frankly. I didn't think this was going to be controversial, but Andy?
I fully share maybe Jen's desire not to get involved in micromanaging the yearbooks. I wonder whether we could, I mean, our focus really here is on inclusion and equity, and can we just cut down the policy to those phrases that actually deal with that, which is the beginning of section 1 and the beginning of section 4. All we really are trying to ensure is that if you were enrolled at the school for any part of the year, you will get your headshot in there and you will get to provide a short text, right? And can we just make that the policy and not get ourselves involved in all the other stuff?
Okay.
Anyway, something to consider if we're going to revisit this.
Dimitri?
So a little bit mixed on the conversation. So I think generally what is shared across the board, we all share the principles of inclusion and equity. So I think what Andy said, yes, we all share it. I think there may be questions around, do we need to be more in conversations, and question as to whether you can have district-wide guidelines or whether you need a policy. But in terms of the principles of inclusion and equity in a yearbook is a given. And of course, in Brookline, we would want every student to be included. I think that's shared across the board. The question then becomes, how do we best implement that? And for that, I don't feel ready yet at the moment to move forward.
All right. Okay, so we'll definitely be revisiting this shortly. And I do want to try to mollify some of the concerns in the chat that when I say we're going to revisit it, I really do mean it, and we'll do it in timely fashion. So I do recognize it's important to a lot of people. So next up, we have a discussion of the residency policy. Now we had discussed this more from an informational perspective at our last meeting. This has also been a subject that's come up and for some other subcommittees and for the full committee. Aaron had indicated to me that there was something that came up recently and that we needed to discuss the policy again. So would someone like, Jennifer?
I am so sorry, David. I had this meeting down from 5 to 6:30, and I have another meeting that is urgent that I need to go to at 6:30 for school committee. So I apologize. You still have a quorum, and I apologize for needing to leave. This is not an unimportant issue, but I need to be in 2 places at once, so I apologize. I need to leave.
Okay. All right, so Mary Ellen, or I guess Megan, you'd probably be the one.
Let me sort of lead it off, and then I'll let Megan give you the details. So the purpose of today is for Megan and I to give you an update about where we are. It's purely for information. There will need to be a second meeting or another meeting to discuss sort of what we hope to be in receipt of. But essentially, this is about sharing information and update, not for a lot of discussion. So it should be, well, I would anticipate it should be relatively quick, but it's really to keep you up to speed so that when we get final information, you've had opportunity to do some sort of private thinking on your own about it. So with Megan, she's going to do an overview of where we are and next steps.
So following our discussion on October 5th at this the last subcommittee meeting, we proceeded as directed to request residency from all of our families as enrolled. And in the meantime, we've dealt with some complications of interpretation, as we anticipated. We got into discussing last time as well. And so at this point, we, Mary Ellen, myself, Erin, and some other folks in senior leadership have put together a document for the Department of Ed, partially upon their request and partially as part of a discussion that we opened with them, trying to help understand the application of both Mass General Law and how our school committee policies sort of fit in together. So we've put together a series of tracking what we do, what is our practice, as well as some clarifying questions, particularly around COVID, where there's some different situations than we've ever faced. Nobody in writing any of these policies could have anticipated that this would be the situation that we're in. So we have some clarification pieces. And then I've also shared with you, should we get some advice from the Department of Education, which we are hoping to receive a response in a fairly timely manner, but it could take them a little bit. We would like to bring that information back to you so that you can consider what their response is as relates to our policy. And should you decide to make any emendations or adjustments, we've shared some information and some thoughts we would like to make sure that the committee is considering as you prepare that.
Okay. Any questions from subcommittee members? No. Anything further, Mary Ellen?
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Look forward to bringing you the response and carrying on this conversation to its end.
So at that point, we'd be like writing like updates to the policy, or simply nodding our heads to one or another question.
I think so. The response from DESE would provide a level of interpretation that has never been interpreted, which I think specifically is how long is temporary, and what does temporary mean? Because the way it has been defined across all the municipalities consistently up until September of this year has now been turned on its head and has implications not only for Brookline, but for every district in the Commonwealth in terms of what temporary means. Our contact at DESE seemed very interested in our conundrum of interpretation. And so we're optimistic that we'll have some guidance back from them. And so it could be that we do nothing because the policy is fine and what we've been doing is fine. It could be that the school committee considers suspending a portion of its policy for a period of time and revisits that. It could be DESE issuing guidance to all cities and towns that puts every residency policy in a revision. This is sort of what I see as kind of the arc.
All right, thank you. All right, so I guess now we can move on to the next topic on our agenda, which is discussion of the 2020-2021 school committee protocols, which Dimitri came up with the entire draft and shared it with us. So thank you very much for that, Dimitri. Would you like to sort of present what you produced?
Yeah, David, I should point out that it's not finished. So what I was hoping to do here is to the subcommittee members is that this is the beginning draft. After our workshop, I've worked with Dorothy, and mostly I am lifting from two major documents. One from the Sudbury School Committee, which I sort of liked the way they had it. And then I drew from the Brookline School Committee 2009 document. So what you have in front of you is sort of the way it's organized. It's a general statement at the top. and then breaking down. So what I'm proposing actually for format is that we would have some general topics, right? So communication. And so on the communications, we would list the school committee protocols that we would want. So that would govern both communication at the school committee level and communication with the district staff and so on. It looks like, you know, we looked at both Concord and Sudbury, which offers that kind of protocols in terms of how they handle a variety of those pieces. There's decision making there, there's communication and so on. So in that document, what I think I ought to do is make sure that all the subcommittee members can have access to the document and add anything else. I would love to go ahead and move it forward and just finalize it some more so that David, you could tell me when you think it's ready for full committee.
Yes. I'm very happy with it. I think this is comprehensive, but in a manner that is digestible and very clear. Andy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I just have one question on the last section, which is about the role of the chair and the vice chair. And the vice chair, I don't think ever gets mentioned in the text. So I'm wondering what the vice chair does on a well-run school committee.
So I actually, this was from the 2009 Brookline School Committee document. So I left it as is. I did think I was going to go through and just sort of try to clarify, because my, you know, just having joined school committee, I'm not clear when the vice chair would kick in and what the difference would be.
So usually what happens is if the chair is absent, then the vice chair is sort of the acting chair for that meeting or for that task. So that might be why there's not a more specific role delineated from the prior version.
Oh, I see. But as long as the chair is functioning, then the vice chair has no role other than,
right.
It's different from the other members. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's very useful to have clarified like who speaks for the school committee, like that, yes. You know, we don't go off giving interviews and that sort of thing.
Definitely. All right, so I would like to move these. Do we have a second? Andy seconds. Andy?
Yes.
Dimitri? And I also vote yes.
Yes.
All right, excellent. So we will now move on to discussion of special education policy implications. And my apologies, Linda and Faith, that we're getting to this so late. I didn't think that the yearbook discussion would last so long, but here we are. So would you like to begin, Linda?
Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. I could have anticipated the yearbook section would take a little while, actually. No, I just wanted to, Faith and I wanted to start out and just kind of give a little bit of context here. We did a survey that was sent out by the Office of Student Services to all families who have children on IEPs or 504s. I should have looked the date up. I can't remember when the survey was sent, but we ended up getting 186 respondents within a couple weeks' time, which is pretty good for us. That's better than I think we've ever had on a survey. So the full survey results are going to be presented on Friday at our monthly CPAC meeting to our community, and then we'll share them. They'll be publicly available and posted on our website for everybody. But we did a little preview. Sorry, I live on a busy road, so that's people being excited that the weather is warm. They've got their motorcycles out tonight. Andy had asked that we add some questions to the survey to try to pull out, are there some policy things that we don't even know exist that affect students with disabilities? And so we asked some of those questions, and we did a little preview with Andy and David a few days ago. And so I think Andy and David kind of went through and pulled a few of their top ones from that. And I'm sure after we present the full results and have the full conversation on Friday, there'll be even more that will come up that will have implications on policy. And obviously yearbook is a hot one for students with disabilities, but there are many other issues as well. So with that, we'll turn it over to David and Andy, and we're just here if there are questions specifically.
All right, so based on that conversation we had that I found tremendously helpful, thank you very much for that. sort of three areas that I identified that would have clear implications for current policies. One was inclusion of paraprofessionals at IEP meetings. Sometimes paraprofessionals actually have the most exposure to a student and would know that student the best and that student's needs. So I think it's critically important that paraprofessionals be in attendance at those IEP meetings. I'm not sure to what extent that already happens. Hopefully it does, but I want to make sure that our policy provides an underpinning to ensure that it always transpires. Unfortunately, we don't have Casey or Maria with us right now, but Linda or Faith, can you comment on how that seems to be working right now in terms of IEP meetings and who participates?
Okay, I pointed to Faith and then she disappeared. Like so many things in our schools, I think that it depends on the school, it depends on the ETF, it depends on the principal, and it isn't consistently done. I think in some previous administrations, there was kind of a rule of paraprofessionals couldn't be allowed. We have been definitely advocating over the last few years to change that. And I think at the senior level, it's pretty well understood that paraprofessionals should be allowed if everybody feels like they have something to contribute to be at the meeting, but it isn't necessarily always filtered down to the ETF level. Oh, you're back, Faith. Do you want to comment or do you still have a screaming child? Screaming child, okay.
Okay, thank you. Sort of another area that came across to me, whether we could include emergency addenda to students on IEP and 504 plans for when they have temporary conditions. So sometimes what might be on the general IEP or the general 504 would not cover a temporary situation. And that's actually something that would be beneficial for all of our students, whether they're on an IEP, 504, or general education. Perhaps a general education student breaks a leg and needs some additional support for a 2-month period. How would we go about that process? There probably should be a formal mechanism by which we could do that. And of course, that's something that comes up quite frequently in the IEP 504 world, but again, for all our students. Linda and or Faith, what currently happens in those situations?
Again, that is handled on a case-by-case basis at each school. And I think for the most part, we try to really help those kids, but I do think that especially when you have a student with a disability. So imagine you have a student with disability who has anxiety and ADHD and they break their leg. So we know what to do for kids who break the leg. We give them a little more time. You know, we make sure that they know where the elevators are and all that. But then the child who has a complicating disability has other things building into that of difficulty dealing in general with this new circumstance. So that makes it more difficult. I think just having, and I don't know whether it's a policy or a procedure, I'm never quite sure exactly which one it should be. So to Mary Ellen's comment earlier, in this case, you know, this might be just sort of education overall, that when these things happen, especially with students with disabilities, there might be more to consider than just the broken leg. It might compound their disability. So how do we make sure that those kids are getting what they need? Right now, it just depends on the principal, the vice principal, and the teachers involved at each and every one of our schools.
David, can I ask Linda a quick question? Linda, just to get some clarity, it seems that what I think I'm hearing from you, from your two answers, is that when it comes to special ed, the variation is left to be from each school. So we do not have some district-wide consistency on how these things ought to be applied or followed.
Yeah, I think when it's something outside the norm. So IEPs, the wonderful thing about IEPs is they protect children, and it doesn't matter which building they are in, their IEP follows them and their IEP protects them. But when things happen outside of the IEP, then it's really up to the discretion of the administrators involved, and depending on how well they know the children and depending on how well they understand special education issues, I mean, we have different levels of understanding of special education just because of exposure. We have schools that have substantially separate programs, and those principals tend to really understand students with disabilities. And then we have schools that don't, and some of those principals just don't have as much experience. And it's not because they don't care and they don't want to know, it's just they don't have that much experience and they don't understand the complexity of how the disability can affect things you just don't even think it will affect.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Then the third area that seems like it has a direct implication on policy, providing support to students for school life outside of the classroom. So what happens for students who want to participate in an after-school drama club or whatever it might be? Do they have the necessary supports in place so that they can be full, vibrant members who are active in the community beyond the federal minimum for what occurs in the classroom? And Linda, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, well, and I'm not even sure it's beyond the federal minimum. I'm not sure that we provide all the supports that are actually there in the law. And Faith could speak better to this because she's actually a trained advocate, whereas I am not. I am an absolute amateur in this area. But our students with disabilities are supposed to be able to participate in the life of the school. And that's in the law. So if you need, in order to participate in this school play, you need a paraprofessional, one-on-one paraprofessional with you. We should be providing that one-on-one paraprofessional. That's my opinion of how the law reads. Faith, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, our students need to be able to access the life of the school.
Yeah, it's in the law.
So is that?
You're muted, Faith. You're muted.
Sorry, yes, that is required. The students are required to be a part of the life of the school. And so if they have after-school programming, they should have, like Linda said, a paraprofessional with them to do sports. They should have a paraprofessional with them to do play if that is what they require to access the life of the school.
Right. And we have to date, we've made progress on this a little bit, but we haven't defined what life of the school means. We haven't put this in a codified way that actually really makes sure that that support is given to those children. It's really based on how much the individual families are fighting, how much the administrators within that school, and how many, like what the resources are, which it should never be resource dependent. It's about what the kid needs, not about the resources we have. We have to find the resources, we as public schools of Brookline. So this one, of all of the ones that you guys keyed on, this one to me is the one that we most need policy on, because we are majoring in the minors on this, of what does that exactly mean? Is that school plays? Is that sports? Is that, so we need to really understand what we as public schools of Brookline are going to do. And I think we're also going to need input from our lawyers, your lawyers, not my lawyers, because I don't have a lawyer, on what the law really requires, because I don't think we're doing what is required by law to.
So David, I'd like to offer that the student activities policy is kind of in revision, and that governs how clubs and organizations get formed. And I believe, because I was actually just writing to Linda and Connie around the yearbook, and I just had written the student activities policy is actually in draft, and it actually might be the student activities policy might be the place to address the equity and inclusion piece for all student clubs and organizations, of which yearbooks is one. And then we kind of get the whole problem solved, because I'm sitting here shaking my head like, we're not paying for paras for plays. Like, well, that's, I know what Linda said, I know and do and have to support and have to find the money along with Casey. So I think the student activities policy might be the policy that we use to embed this equity and inclusion around student clubs and organizations and get all of them. Not just yearbook, but get all of them. Get plays, you're going to get them all. You're going to get the literary magazine. You're going to get everything.
Right.
So I will pull that policy out. I'll send, if Linda doesn't mind, I'll send it to her.
And Faith.
And Faith. I think I have your I don't know if I have your, I think I should have your email.
You do. You do.
You do.
I'm going to send it with the email I have half written, and end the email differently. Because I think that's the place to solve this overarching equity, access, and issue. Student club organization, because it's a K-12 policy, with hands down. So anyway, that's where my brain just went to solve this in a big way, big picture.
But Mary Ellen, are you saying that we are currently providing for paraprofessional for students to be able to be part in the full life of the school, or is it happening at the reservation of a school principal?
Well, so my answer is we should be. I don't know what's happening on the ground.
Okay.
I know that when it comes to me, I'm moving to get it to happen. So they're not, I'm not, if they get it to me, I'm not the problem. Yeah. Because I already know that we should be. Like, that's like, there's certain things I'll have a discussion with you on, and there are others I'm just going to go do. Yeah. And that's one of them. Yeah. Like, yeah. An extra, like, I know Pete Rittenberg puts on additional, we've actually devised an additional sort of assistant, like an assistant coach, like to help and support in athletics for students, particularly track season. I know we have additional coaches that come on. He had another sports team. He put an additional coach on to support some special education students that were participating on those sports teams. So I know Pete Rittenberg is doing it. I know in athletics we put a pay structure in play as well to assist with that. But for the plays and choral and all that stuff, I'm not quite sure where all of that is at. I know when it gets to me, I'm trying to figure out how to push it through and fund it.
Yeah, we haven't found that Mary Ellen and Casey are the challenge. It's just getting to that point. And parents not always understanding that when somebody somewhere along the chain says no to you, that you can keep moving that upward to get to where you really need to go. And just having a policy to make it clear to everybody that students with disabilities have the same right to be involved in the life of the school as students without disabilities is really important, really.
And that also includes when there's after school programming and it's run by parents. It should include all after school activities, not like, so I'm thinking particularly from K to 8, there should be a way to facilitate any after school programming that is happening in the schools all the time.
Yeah, that actually it's a really good point. It becomes more complicated than the school sponsored, but the PTO sponsored events also, when you have a Halloween party, how do you make sure that that's open to everybody and to participate in the life of the school? Because I would argue those are at least as important as the things that are literally done by school administrators. So how much do we want to support that, and how much do we have to support that? And what can we do? I think it's a really important question. And we have had cases where students who have been moved out of district or who are in temporary placements have been told they're not allowed to come into the building. Like, they're not allowed to come to a PTO event, but they're not even allowed to come clear out their locker. Like, you're not in the building because you're not a student here. I've been really fortunate. My daughter is out of district, but Baker School has been really, really welcoming to her whenever she comes to an event, and they've been really lovely. But I know it's again just very dependent on the school, and we have to fix that for students with disabilities. It's not okay.
All right, Andy, any thoughts you'd like to add?
Oh, thank you to Linda and Faith for helping us with that. That's really important to hear. And so I guess Mary Ellen suggested a sort of natural home for us to work on the third of the 3 things that you pulled out. David, do you have existing policies in mind that we could tweak for the other 2, or would we be starting from scratch?
I think I can look a little more to see if there's some existing policies that the other two could fit into. If not, we could craft a new one. So I'll look through that some more.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't see anything in the policy manual like that, you know, that's about how you set up an IEP meeting. It's just.
Right, that part might be more of a procedure.
Mm-hmm.
So we could talk further with Casey about how that's handled.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not being handled sufficiently, then we probably would need to add a policy to make sure that it is. All right. Any other thoughts, Linda or Faith? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on this evening and being very patient and waiting for close to the end in order to have this discussion. This is just the first of many more to come, I'm quite sure, but want to make sure that we continue with the momentum and that this is going to be a major focus area for this subcommittee this year. And I'm sure that there are far more than just these three areas, but those were some that came clear to me from our conversation about what we can immediately begin work on. And thank you, Mary Ellen, for mentioning the student activities policy and how that could be a place where we look to address at least one of these three sub areas.
Yeah, I'm going to add in there the field trip policy because that may have been problematic also in the past.
Yeah, we did a lot of work on the field trip policy. I think it was last year or the year before, but that's always one that is challenging. And I think making sure people understand the policy is also, then it's the executional part of it. I just want to thank, Faith and I would like to thank Andy and David, and we really do appreciate your advocacy for students with disabilities, and you guys have been tremendous. You're doing really great work, and I know we're kind of a pain in the neck, and we really appreciate you sticking with us on it.
Yes, we do. Thank you, guys.
You're welcome. All right, so that brings us to the last item, which is usually the quickest, which is new business. Does anyone have new business? Andy, Dimitri, Mary Ellen, anyone? No? All right, then that concludes our meeting for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending and participating.